There are cases that the law decides, and then there are cases that a nation decides, loudly, emotionally, dangerously, long before any judge gets a word in. The Nanavati case was the second kind. It was a murder trial that became a confession booth for an entire country, about honor, about class, about who we protect and who we punish, and about what we are willing to call justice when the man standing in the dock is someone we'd rather call a hero. It begins, as so many catastrophes do, with a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Commander K.M. Nanavati was the kind of man who made a room feel different when he entered it. Tall, decorated, impeccably turned out in his naval whites, a Parsi from Bombay, which in the 1950s meant you came with a certain pedigree attached. He had joined the Indian Navy, risen through the ranks of distinction, and somewhere along the way, on a training stint in England, he met a young Englishwoman named Sylvia. They married, they returned to Bombay, they had 3 children, and moved into a comfortable home in Covey Parade, in the kind of neighborhood where the sea breeze never really leaves and the rent is always too high. On paper, it was everything. The uniform, the English wife, the children, the sea-facing flat. Bombay's elite social circuit welcomed them with open arms. By every external measure, Commander Nanavati had built a life that other men spent their entire careers aspiring to. But the Navy, as it always does, kept taking him away. For months at a stretch, sometimes longer, Nanavati would be out at sea, and Sylvia, young, far from her homeland, raising 3 children in a city that was not hers, was left alone. Not just physically alone, emotionally alone. The loneliness of a woman in a foreign country, surrounded by people who adore her husband more than they know her, is a particular kind of quiet. It builds slowly, and it looks, from the outside, exactly like contentment. It was through Bombay's social circles that the Nanavatis met Prem Bhagwandas Ahuja. He was a Sindhi businessman, wealthy, bachelor, well-connected, and by all accounts, extraordinarily charming. He lived in an apartment building in Malabar Hill called Jeevan Jyot, meaning flame of life. The irony of that name would not become clear until much later. Prem Ahuja was the kind of man who was always available, always entertaining, always present. Everything, in other words, that Nanavati could not be. The affair began sometime around 1956. It lasted over a year. Sylvia visited Ahuja at his flat regularly while Nanavati was away, and somewhere in that year, something shifted. What had started as companionship became attachment, and what became attachment became love, or at least what Sylvia understood as love. She wanted more than a secret. She wanted a future. She asked Ahuja directly, would he marry her? Would he take her children and give them a home? He never gave her a real answer, which, as it turned out, was answer enough. April 27, 1959, Commander Nanavati came home from his latest posting. The moment he walked through the door, something felt wrong. Sylvia was cold, distant. She moved through the apartment like a woman waiting for something terrible to happen. He asked her what was wrong. She denied it. He asked again, the way a man who has spent years giving orders asks, not loudly, but with a precision that doesn't leave much room for evasion. And finally, over lunch, in their flat in Covey Parade, Sylvia broke. She told him everything, the affair, the year and a half, Prem Ahuja. What Nanavati did next says everything about the kind of man he was, or at least the kind of man he wanted to be seen as. He didn't shout, he didn't hit anyone. He went very, very still, and he asked his wife one question. Does he intend to marry you and look after the children? Sylvia had no answer to give him. Ahuja had never given her one either. Nanavati made a decision. He took his wife and 3 children out. He had promised them a trip to the cinema. He drove them to the Metro Cinema, dropped them off to watch Tom Thumb, told them he'd be back, and drove away. Where he went next tells you something important about this story. He did not go to find Ahuja, not yet. He drove to his ship, to the naval base, and he walked into the storeroom where the weapons were kept. He signed out a semi-automatic revolver and 6 cartridges. He told the officer in charge that he needed it for protection. A long drive, he said, some unsafe roads. The officer handed it over without question. You don't question a commander. He loaded the gun in the car. He drove to Ahuja's office first. Ahuja wasn't there, so he drove to Jeevan Jyot. He went up to the flat. He knocked on the door. Ahuja had just come out of a bath. He was wearing nothing but a white towel around his waist when he answered. Nanavati came inside. He confronted Ahuja. He asked him the same question he asked Sylvia. Will you marry her? Will you take responsibility for the children? And Ahuja laughed. and then he said the sentence that would be quoted in newspapers, in courtrooms, in law schools, and in living rooms across India for the next several decades. Am I supposed to marry every woman I sleep with? 3 shots were fired. Prem Ahuja fell to the floor and died. The white towel, investigators would later note, was still perfectly in place on his body, completely undisturbed, as if he had never moved at all. Nanavati did not run. He drove directly to the Provost Marshal of the Western Naval Command, told him what happened, and then surrendered to the Bombay police. He was arrested and charged under Section 302 of the Indian Penal Code, murder in first degree. And that is when Bombay, and then the whole country, stopped what it was doing and paid attention. Blitz was Bombay's most popular tabloid, aggressive, sensational, and edited by a man named R.K. Karangia, who happened to be a Parsi himself, the same community as Nanavati. Karangia looked at this case and saw something far more valuable than a crime story. He saw a moral legend. Week after week, Blitz put Nanavati on the front page. It painted Commander Nanavati as the tragic hero, the devoted husband, the decorated officer, betrayed by a cold wife, and destroyed by a predatory, immoral businessman who preyed on lonely women and felt no responsibility for the wreckage he left behind. Prem Ahuja was the villain. His dying words were the proof. India consumed it. The Parsi community of Bombay rallied behind Nanavati with extraordinary passion. Naval officers expressed their solidarity openly. Women's groups held competing debates, some defending Sylvia, some condemning her. The Sindhi community felt their people were being made into villains. What had begun as a murder case had become a cultural conflict, playing out in newspaper columns, dinner table arguments, and street corner conversations from Bombay to Delhi to Madras. It was India's first viral story. No internet, no social media, just millions of people across a vast country talking about the same case, the same names, the same question. Was he a murderer, or was he a man defending his honor? The trial opened on September 23, 1959, in the Bombay Sessions Court, and here is where India's legal history bends in a direction nobody expected. In 1959, India still used the jury system, a holdover from British colonial law. 9 ordinary citizens would sit in judgment of Commander Nanavati. His defense team argued provocation. They said Nanavati was a broken man, acting in a moment of overwhelming anguish. He hadn't planned anything. He had simply shattered under the weight of what Ahuja said to him, and a gun was there when he shattered. Under Indian law at the time, if a killing happened under grave and sudden provocation, it was culpable homicide, not murder, a significantly lesser charge. The prosecution, led by Y.V. Chandrachud, a man who would eventually become the Chief Justice of India, and assisted by a young, already formidable Ram Jethmalani. They were methodical and they were merciless. Look at the timeline, they said. After learning of the affair, Nanavati had hours. He drove his family to a cinema. He went to a naval base. He signed out a weapon using a false pretext. He drove to Ahuja's office, didn't find him, and then drove to his flat. That is not a man who snapped. That is a man who planned. Every single step, the cinema, the gun, the search, was deliberate. And then there was the towel. If there had been a struggle, as Nanavati claimed, if the gun had gone off accidentally during a fight, how was the towel still perfectly in place? How had a man who had just been wrestling for his life ended up looking exactly as he had when he answered the door? The jury heard it all. They deliberated, and they came back with a verdict of 8-1, not guilty. The streets outside erupted. People cheered. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. The Parsi community celebrated. Justice, said the crowd, had been done. But the judge, Justice Ratil B. Bitta, looked at the verdict and looked at the evidence, and he used a provision of the law that most people had forgotten existed. He declared the verdict perverse, so contrary to the evidence that no reasonable jury could have reached it, and referred the entire case to the Bombay High Court. The High Court did not share the jury's sentimentality. On March 11, 1960, Justices Shalat and Naik overturned the acquittal. Nanavati was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He appealed to the Supreme Court of India. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction, life imprisonment confirmed by the highest court in the land. And then the governor of Maharashtra intervened. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit had recently been appointed governor. She was also, and this detail matters enormously, the sister of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. The Supreme Court had explicitly stated that the governor's pardoning power could not be exercised while a petition was still pending before the court. The instruction was clear. It was ignored. Governor Pandit granted Nanavati a full pardon.
The legal establishment was outraged. Here was a man the Supreme Court of India had just confirmed as a murderer, being freed by political connection. The Ahuja family, who had lost a son and a brother and had never been asked what justice meant to them, watched it happen in silence. Nanavati served just over 3 years in custody. He was then permitted to leave India. He emigrated to Canada with Sylvia and the children. In one of the stranger footnotes of this entire story, the couple reconciled. They remained married. Nanavati died in Canada in 2003, never having publicly wavered from his version of events. The legacy of Nanavati Case reaches farther than any single life or any single family. Because of this case, the jury system in India was abolished. What the trial had demonstrated catastrophically and publicly was that a jury of ordinary people could be so thoroughly swayed by a newspaper, by a community loyalty, by the simple magnetism of a man in uniform that they would ignore forensic evidence, ignore logic, and ignore the law itself. The verdict of 8-1 had not been a legal judgment, it had been a popularity contest.